Go hit it.
Okay, so how did the pandemic, COVID-19, 2021, 22, epitomize the failure of our public health system? Well, I hope it epitomized that we never had anything like that to begin in the first place, right? There's a lot of words that we use to say things that I don't think a lot of us sometimes understand. I didn't understand, even being within healthcare, right? What does it mean to care? What does healthcare actually mean? What does public health actually mean? And when you think about what it takes for people to be healthy in the first place, we actually don't have any of that infrastructure, and that can't be created in the middle of a disaster. We live in a society where people think, normal, whatever they consider to be normal, is something that we've normalized. We've normalized living under brutal oppression. We've normalized living in a society where we don't have the right to live. So thinking about that a little bit, none of us choose to be born, but once we are, we're told that we actually have to earn the right to live. So we have to earn the right to access basic survival resources like food, water, shelter, community care, just love, support. And all of those things are equally important for us to survive and thrive. Our needs aren't actually hierarchical. Our needs are equally important. So we need food, water, shelter, just as much as we need love and community care and collectivism, right? We rely on each other. We're a fundamentally collectivist, interdependent species, and not just on other people. Our health is directly tied to the health of every single living and non-living being in our ecosystem. So our health is tied to plants, animals, microbes, the land that we live on, the water that we can access. And essentially what capitalism has done is commodified and objectified all of us, right? So what that means is it's taken everything on this planet and called it worthless until otherwise, worthless until it can be extracted and exploited for profit. And that includes people, right? So people have to sell our bodies and minds in the form of labor to earn the right to live. But the earth has to prove itself, right? The earth has to be extracted from endlessly in order for profit to be generated for a few. And that's what makes it valuable. And that's the framework of the society that we live in, that no one actually has inherent worth. Nothing is inherently valuable. Nothing is inherently worth caring for. So we live in a society that doesn't actually have any infrastructure for us to have any sort of healthcare to begin with. And then in the pandemic, I think people just realized, oh, good God, this is a multi-point system failure on all fronts, right? Not just from the perspective of caring for our health, but why did the virus even emerge in the way that it did in the first place, right? It was a direct result of the climate crisis. It was a direct result of capitalism endlessly extracting from our planet to no end, to the point where our Earth cannot regenerate itself. And we have widespread habitat destruction and all of that, right? All of that has led to industrialization, urbanization, destruction of so much of our forests, has led to microbes and human beings and plants and animals living in a pressure cooker, essentially, where we're forced to reckon with all of these stressors that are emerging constantly. And we know what that looks like for us, right? Oppression kills people either slowly or fast. So either you have, we're living in a society where everyone's depressed and anxious, or people are just dying of starvation. It's just different sides of the same spectrum, right? We're living in a society where everything about it is we're waking up, we're doing the same thing, we're on a hamster wheel, and we work and we go to bed, but we don't actually have any free time or free will or autonomy, which is exactly what you need to be able to be healthy. You need to be connected to the land that you're on and to everything living within it, and we don't actually have time to do any of that. And that's very selective. It's very intentional. It's how capitalism is designed in the first place. And that's basically what COVID was. It was an amalgamation of all that coming together to hopefully make it more clear to people that what was normal was never okay to begin with. We've normalized it, but that's trauma, right? Anything can be normalized if it's titrated enough over a long period of time. You've been born into this world and it's all you've ever known, right? And that's why it's normal, because it's all we've ever been exposed to, but not because it's the only thing that's possible.
The old world is ending.
And we have the opportunity to rethink everything.
This is a show about the systemic problems in our world.
And the real solutions we have today.
To transition from an apocalyptic storm of war, scarcity, and ecological collapse.
To create an abundantly advanced, collaborative society.
That sustains all life.
You may think it's an impossible dream.
But the alternative is an inevitable nightmare.
We're your hosts, Matt Holton,
Amanda Smith,
and Zachary Marlowe.
And together,
we can move past this economic absurdity
and come together to actualize our collective potential.
To create something completely new.
We are
Mindless Society.
Before we dive into another revolutionary dialogue, I want to encourage everyone listening or watching to help keep Moneyless Society free by supporting us on Patreon or through a one-time or recurring tax-deductible donation through our website. All of this is a labor of love, a gift, but we can't keep it going without your support. Help us sow seeds of that new world and get involved with our organization to help them grow. Remember, the light bulb was invented by candlelight. We critique these systems while depending on them because there is no alternative. Okay, we're live. I don't have a high energy, bombastic intro today. Today's about healing. It's about going beyond that. We're all here in our little podcast setups with our headsets and our mics and our little like we're in our little spaceship going to take down the Death Star. So yeah, today's episode is about a simple question, but a big question, one that's literally too big for the episode we set out for, but we've got the perfect person to deal with that. And that question is, how is capitalism bad for us on a personal, physical, mental health basis? How's capitalism bad for our health? So today we have actually the most perfect person that I know on the planet, not just that I know in my little Rolodex of radical comrades, but on the planet to talk about this. We have the one, the only Ayesha Khan, woke scientist. She's like the nightmare of all neoliberals and conservatives. She is like everything that they are afraid of. Not only is she educated in the existing systemic, fucking pedigrees in the hard practice. He is a fucking radical organizer, a decolonist to the soul, somebody that has tasted and felt the fucking claw of fire in her for her entire life, who has just turned that into what I call a fire hose of revolutionary sound bites. So that's basically what we're up for today. So Ayesha, take it away.
I think somewhere to get started that can be really simple is the word health. Is one of those words that we just talk about like we know what it means. But when you actually start asking yourself, what does it mean to be healthy? I think it's kind of a black hole. Like when you ask yourself, who is considered healthy, who isn't? What do we need to be healthy? Like what kind of world do we actually need to live in to have some baseline level of health? And also health, when I say the word health, people think of it in a very individualistic sort of individual personal health way. But our health is inextricably tied to the health of the rest of our ecosystems, right? The land and plants, animals, microbes, everything that is within our ecosystem. And I think that's a good place to start, just to think about like what would we even need to have some level of health. And capitalism is essentially a society that doesn't have any baseline conditions for health, right? We live in a society that doesn't give us the right to live. We have to earn that right. So and I don't even want to go into like having a hierarchy of needs, because there isn't, right? Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a colonial sort of myth. We need food, water, shelter just as much as we need love, community care, relationships. Like those are all equal in terms of their priority and what we need to survive and thrive, not just like get by every day, right? And capitalism essentially is 21st century colonialism. So things that we need to be healthy, it can also be harder to even like get to that answer when we haven't really ever had it, right? We've never had guaranteed survival. We've never had we weren't born into a society where we were connected to our land, right? Like we are the most separated people in these living in little cement boxes, separated from each other, separated from the rest of our ecosystem, separated from the land. So it's even harder to figure out what you don't have, because it's easier to look at like overt violence and think of like, oh yeah, obviously it's bad. But when the absence of something is almost harder to figure out. And I think that's essentially what capitalism does. It's a lifetime of just being in fight or flight, right? Trying to earn the right to live. And that very obviously will dramatically impact our overall health when we're, like you just kind of said, when we're being commodified and turned into objects. And all of us are being objectified, right? Turned into objects that can be extracted and exploited for profit. No wonder our land's unhealthy, because the planet is exponentially being extracted from. So I guess the lack of sustainability and the lack of care, not just to human beings, but the land itself, right? The lack of care put into stewarding lands is a great, like, a great recipe for disaster where everyone's health is then impacted. And it can't be separated from each other too.
I filmed Ayesha
Nice.
say that like 10
Thank
times, 10
you.
different ways at the CDC when we met up in Atlanta to film Radical Rants for the movie. Yeah, and it's just it's so powerful. You were talking about how the way that we're overworked, our microbiology is overworked as well. And this really just epitomizes and gets down to like the deep root of the ways that like stress and trauma and diet and food and air quality and all of these things cycle together. I mean, we talk a lot on this program and this little movement we got here going here, this little anti-capitalist, post-capitalist movement to talk about how things are connected, how everything is connected. So yeah, the way that Western medicine tries to make sense of health is wait till you get sick and then squirt something in you to fix you
Well,
up.
and not just wait till you get sick, right? It's almost sickness is more profitable than health. There's a reason like public health is just dramatically underfunded. Not just underfunded. It's like what 2% of this country's funding, governmental funding, goes into public health. And again, if you think about the entire model of capitalism, right? It's profit maximization. More profit is good. It'll never be profitable to keep people healthy, and it goes fundamentally against the model of like having any sort of land health is in fundamental opposition to capitalism, right? Capitalism's goal is endless extraction, put the least in to get the most out. So put the least amount of care into the land, right? But maximize yield, get the most amount of crops, like you have giant monocrop farms, right? Same thing to the individual, right? Don't actually care about people, don't give them food, water, shelter, manipulate them into earning that, manipulate them into just willingly being indentured servants, essentially. And then you can keep extracting, keep extracting, keep extracting. When they fall out of line, so when they're too sick to go to work, the most you can do is essentially patch them back up to send them back out into the conditions that made them sick in the first place, right? Yeah, Amanda, I see you raising your hand.
Because I just want to speak to everything you're saying there. And just now you made a wonderful point about how when people get sick, patch them up, send them back out into the battlefield of earning a living. And I think that speaks to also how people who are permanently or semi-permanently incapacitated, such as people on disability, are treated and swept under the rug, as they say, because they can't produce for the system and they can't consume from the system. So they are therefore useless to the system and treated like they're disposable, but more so than the rest of us. That part of the public health system is probably the biggest bane of all of its existence. But I love how in the beginning your spill there started with how this system is anti-life at its core, and that inherently omits any level of public health that we could hope for, as you were saying, pretty much. But I think putting it in those terms really brings it home, the way that you explained all of that. Like, we can't have public health or any level of effectiveness within that sector of the system if we start out at the gate completely disconnected from the chain of life that we're a part of. Like, if we don't live as interconnected beings with this earth and all of the living organisms on it, let alone with each other, health is not ever going to be in the picture.
Yeah, and I think I want people to even start thinking bigger about, like, I mean, to answer the first point, I think society disables us all, but to different extents, right?
Right.
Again, we're all just put on a ladder, hierarchies in terms of how productive each of us are, right? And everyone is disabled since, well, 99% of us are. But I feel like people are starting to sort of maybe even see that ability is tied directly to your ability to participate in generating profit for the elite and rich, right? So it's not correlated with anything else, like real meaningful jobs in terms of like providing for your community. That has nothing to do with it. It's more people are doing made up jobs, right? But also, I think even stepping back to understanding, like, what is the purpose of the healthcare system, right? Why is it here? The context of every system that is within our dominant society right now. So from police, prisons, to the education system, to healthcare systems, all of those, right? Governments, nation states, their structure, they're all colonial systems. All of them are, right? From how we farm to how we eat our food, everything is a colonial system now, and we're forced to rely on them. And there's serious consequences, because then you think about it, like what kind of system would come out of an empire, right? Whose goal is to dominate, to extract, exploit, control, and subjugate. There is no like what kind of, but I think it's kind of worse for healthcare systems, because there's this illusion of humanitarianism, right? People talk about how medicine and science are inherently benevolent systems that are doing the best for humanity, that are doing the best.
Not if
There's
they're for profit.
races, right? Well, and I mean, not even just not if they're for profit, the whole foundation to begin with, right?
Right.
You can't just take away capitalism and separate it, because capitalist systems are colonial systems. And
Very
so
good
the
point.
goal going in, like when you ask why was it created, it was created, one, like we just talked about, to patch people up so you continue to have a stream of workers. You need a stream of workers. You can't get workers, the vast majority of workers, to be too sick, right? You need them to get them back up somehow. And also as a method of population control and subjugation. So when people fall out of line in different ways, I think that's where psychiatry serves that purpose of pathologizing their distress, right? So it's not just that it's not meant to work for you. It was actually designed to have a very insidious purpose, right? So one, to profit off of sickness. There is nothing more profitable than sick people. You can eternally, like from pharmaceutical industries to medical procedures, right? It's a gold mine technically of profit. Go ahead.
To speak really quickly to that, and to define colonization. And this I found a book on the streets here of New York City last year when I was here, called Power and Quiescence, or something about coal miners, and like asking the question, why don't they rise up? Why don't they shake off the yoke and stand up straight and shake the parasite off? And it really redefined how I view colonization, because it's not just countries afar. They talked about how Appalachia is a giant sacrifice zone, a place where the health and the ecosystem of the entire place is just literally blown up. They blow up the top of the mountains. They shoot coal dust into the air. All the kids have asthma. They just sacrifice the lifestyle, the quality, and the inherent value of all these people, so that they can extract profits from them and send them way the fuck far away. I mean, this can even happen. I mean, our sense of scale, when we look at the map and we see these nice, neatly drawn lines, that everything seems all nice and bifurcated and sensical, even though there's no sense to the way that we cut this place up, other than just, I want this piece here, I want this. So it's like these systems exist to take to suck life from very far away. That's essentially colonization. What a colony is. It's this parasite with a straw, It's very, very far away. And it says, your life doesn't matter. You exist actually to sustain me. So one of the darkest things in this book was that after they blew the mountaintops up and they sucked everything out of their own fucking people that they possibly could, and after the coal industry started to dwindle, because it's obviously destroying the planet as it's destroying our own bodies, that the industry that swept up in there, that came in there to keep profiting off of those human beings in that sacrifice zone, that colony, was the pharmaceutical companies, because they left these people with all this pain and all this hurt and this anguish, and
Cued the
they just
opioid
continued to profit off of their pain, the pain that they created.
Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly how capitalism works, right? It sells you, quote unquote, non-solutions to the problems it creates. That's how it creates entire industries. It makes everyone into a consumer that way, right? So that's how a lot of psychiatry works, by even literally fabricating made up things, like now that have been disproven, like the chemical imbalance myth, only because the drug they're trying to sell you increases one neurotransmitter. So they need to somehow convince you that you're sad because you have the lack of a neurotransmitter. So it's always inverse, right? They first find something they want to market, and then they need to create demand for it somehow. And that's essentially how all of medicine works, but I think it can be more obvious with mental health diagnoses. But all of medicine basically serves to not just profit off of sickness, but if you're like blaming people for their sickness, right? That's a really good way to maintain oppression, because you tell, like, if they're hurting, it's your fault.
You're
It's not the
blaming
system, it's
individual.
Right.
Instead of the system, and the environment.
And that's how medicine works, right? It addresses health in a vacuum in individuals, as though they're unaffected by everything else around them.
If I can piggyback off that really quick, Marlo, because I know you're waiting to say something.
I'm going to have things to say the whole time here.
We all are.
Even though I could literally just leave the room and you guys could just crush an episode, and I'll just listen back like, oh, fuck yeah, this is great.
Our guests certainly could. Non-solution. I am loving that term so much, and especially in conjunction to with the medical system that we have today. Myself personally, having family members who are neurodivergent, who've been through the mill of the medical system and the disability system, seeing how, again, you are absolutely treated utterly like nothing more than a number and how many numbers that you can produce. The non-solutions that we've encountered have sadly been in the places that we went searching for solutions, as is common. But though I'm never surprised these days, I'm never not disappointed when we are, say, in the mental health service realm, and all we get are more and more nudges and coping mechanisms to help us be productive with, like in-system solution type stuff. Like, this is how we can make sure that you can work 9 to 5 versus let's talk about how having to go to work and be around people and do things that are monotonous is affecting your mental health. Let's talk about how you're not getting paid enough to pay your rent to keep you from being stressed and how that might be affecting your mental health. Let's talk about how you're being oppressed because of your ethnics or your background, your criminal history or whatever, which was probably arbitrary too. And let's talk about how that's affecting your mental health. But no, it's all just about, let's let you talk to us about your problems for a little while and tell you how to get back to work and pay your bills and live a normal life. And that is the biggest non-solution for me that
Right.
I think needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just that's kind of all how all of medicine works, right? So, not to say that there aren't selective tools that have been beneficial that have come out of like medicine in the current shape and form, right? Like antibiotics, great, vaccines, great. But I think those have emerged not because of capitalism, despite it, right? Because as human beings that care, there are people within frameworks of medicine that went into it like me early on, right? Very much convinced that we're going to help our community, is very much convinced that it is possible for us to work within the framework of the system to redirect resources, et cetera. So there has been some innovation that has come out just due to human altruism, right? That we care but you can almost imagine how much innovation hasn't happened as a result of profit maximization being the goal, right? I think that's one way to think about it, because there's never a binary. It's not kind of like, let's just get rid of everything that medicine has come up with, right? But also speaking to, like, it's a very colonial way of looking at health, right? So besides there being no conditions for health in the first place, another binary is sort of the separation of the mind and body, right? This idea that's concocted that mental health is this distinct realm that is unrelated to our physical well-being, right? In the same way where individual health is separate from community health, human health is separate from land health, right? It's all these divisions. And if you think of where that comes from, divide and conquer works really well, right? To say that, hey, we can keep extracting from the land and drill for oil, that will not do anything to your health. Don't worry, right? We can destroy the planet that you live on and somehow still you'll be healthy, right?
That's the thesis of extraction. Like, it's
Right.
infinite.
And in the
That's the
same
thesis of infinite growth.
Right. And in the same vein, mind and body separation are not really a thing, right? Like you can't since we're born, our health has been desecrated by the conditions that we've lived under, right? And I even now push back against the binary of like neurodivergent, neurotypical, because it is bioessentialist, right? And that's another thing medicine does. It tries to reduce our problems to biological defects and disorders, or even the idea that there can be clean biological separations, kind of like what Marlo talked about. It's not just nation states, right? Apply that same model of made up borders and divisions to what we are led to believe, that there's clear biological differences between people, right? You can put some people in one box, people in the other. And now we have people believing that like capitalism works for some people, the quote unquote neurotypicals, and it just doesn't work for other people, when that's not true, right?
We don't like boxes around here.
Right. And no one's health is thriving because they're being turned into, robotified automatons. No one is supposed to work in a cubicle for 9 hours a day. No one is supposed to be exploited and extracted, even if they're not necessarily saying that they identify under these like categories, right? Everyone is really sick. We've just normalized how sick we are.
And that, pardon the pun, is the sickening part.
Yeah, that's something I can that's my life experience. If anybody asks like what radicalized you or whatever, it's like it's being told that I am sick for having a brain that is different. That is like capitalism's, prides itself on, being all about the individual and caring about, individual excellence and greatness. And yet it is so brutally alien to anyone different, to anyone who genuinely exhibits a different way of thinking. It's like mental ill. I was told I was mentally ill my whole life because I had like too much energy, or I was asking too many questions, or, I had just too much for this system, when it's like, if this system was even halfway good at what it does or what it claims to think that it is doing, it would be like, oh, you have an excess of energy. I'm going to turn you into a battery of some sort, put
Yeah.
you into some kind
Yeah.
of wheel
And I
and
mean,
make you do something. Take your
Mhm.
creative brain and be like, oh, draw,
productivity. Yeah.
architectural drawings, or draw things like this, or design us new products. Or like, I was drawing constantly, and I was basically getting slapped on the hand by teachers because I didn't fit the very narrow set of like parameters of what they think is important for me to be doing. And it's all so toxic. And to be told your whole life you are sick for the way your brain works
Right.
is
And if you think about where does that come from? Like, where does that idea of who's sick, who isn't comes from, right? Normal, abnormal. Like, who creates those criteria? Who decides, right? And who decides what the gold standard for normal is? And again, that is inherently what
Colonial,
colonialism
hierarchical.
does, right?
Right.
And even the forced conformity and assimilation. So essentially, there's one way, there's one standard, right? Gold standard. Everyone is compared in relation to that. Even the fact that we have nation states, right? One type of structure around the world. Like, medicine wasn't just asserted because it was the best, like colonial modern form of colonial medicine wasn't just asserted because it was the best form, but it was built as a result of colonialism as individual, like a diversity of traditional local healing systems were erased. And it was forced upon these communities, and it's still here, right? Everywhere around the world, people practice Western medicine. And just this idea that there's one way to be, it's one size fits all model, right? And that's the same logical binaries of any kind, right? Normal, abnormal, and who's considered abnormal or normal, right? And like, for example, the DSM-5, I guess psychiatry, that it would be, this is a good point to go into psychiatry. All of the diagnostic categories in psychiatry are social constructs, and all of them, right? Psychiatry is a little more obvious than other fields of medicine where there is no biomarker. So there's not a single biological test you go take, right? Everything is subjective. So there is no inter-psychiatrist reliability, which means you can go to a different psychiatrist and get a laundry list of 50 diagnoses from each one. And that is kind of even ridiculous for modern medicine standards, right? So even given that medicine does a horrible job of addressing our health in general, right, it would be kind of ridiculous to go to a different oncologist and get a different cancer diagnosis, right? Like, that's not really acceptable. Like, I specialize in the diagnosis of infectious diseases. I do have to actually isolate the bug that's causing an infection. And there is a way of thinking about, whoa, well, we throw a bunch of drugs at the bug to figure out what kind of antibiotic can we give the patient based on what kills the bug. Psychiatry is the Wild West. There are no treatment guidelines. You can give anything to people. You can diagnose them with anything based on an arbitrary checklist, right? And the DSM-5, the word that it uses more than any other word is work and then school in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how to pathologize people, right?
Yes,
People that are
you're
not
absolutely
doing
right.
well at work, and school, which are the same thing. School is a factory for workers.
Thank you. Yes. Could I just really quickly, I want to make a correlation here. Just a couple of moments ago, in what you were just saying, you made a statement that to me sounded like you were basically spelling out the fact that colonialized medicine caused an erasure of plant medicine, right? And if you haven't been on this show yet, Decriminalize Nature, if you haven't talked to those folks yet, I would love to see the two of you connect and blow things up because that's what they do. That's what they talk about, is how we've got to get reconnected with what we call nature as if it's separate from
Right.
ourselves, but
As it's different.
in that way learn to heal through our relationship with plants.
So
And that
it's
is
not
something that's
just
been taken from us, paywalled, and criminalized.
So not just plant medicine, right? That's one alternative modality. So it's more so that there's thousands of different approaches to health and healing, right? And colonialism, what it does is picks one and then forces it onto everybody else. And it is the best approach, the most dominant approach, right?
Right.
Even the idea of domination, the idea that there's a superior inferior, that's a colonial idea, right? So
Right.
it's more that there's spiritual approaches there's political approaches to health, right? And also separating, it's not just even plants, because now you have people, because we talked about it, right? There's entire industries, because capitalism does a really good job of co-opting things. So there's a self-care industry, there's a mental health industry, there's a wellness industry. Plants have been co-opted to give it, to give people these solutions that they can buy, right? Products.
Right.
So it's more
Modified.
that traditional healthcare systems did not look at individual health even as a concept, really, that it was about community health, right? And our community health was always tied to land, and that you can't take a cure, put it in a bottle, in a pill, and think that that's going to do the job. Because right now, microbes are being put into pills, given to people, thinking that that's going to fix our gut issues, right? When you can't do that in the context of not changing anything structurally about the society that we live in.
Right.
Yeah, I've gotten suckered many times by like some new plant that's been unearthed from some corner of the globe that capitalism has figured out how to sell to me. You know, oh, I need those adaptogens. Oh, I need the reishi.
Yeah,
Oh, no,
exactly.
I need the spirulina. No, the moringa. You know, so I want to kind of sort of spiral our way into a different sort of direction here. I'm kind of picking up on this, or thinking this sort of spidey sense in my gut about the sort of conspiratorial nature of industries that interlock within capitalism. So we have our toxic food system that obviously creates sickness in the body. We have these, you know, fossil fuels that create these particulates in the air that ultimately feed into the pharmaceutical industries. And these are all interconnected by our financial system, which is the ultimate colonial superpower, the ultimate, you know, blanket that makes all flattened down into the same shape, that we have this monetary system, this way of exchanging money and commodities for things that basically automatically, algorithmically structures life into this shape. And when it falls out, when things don't fit the algorithm of making the money number go up bigger, then it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. So I kind of want to, on that note of like conspiracy, like capitalism is this organized conspiracy. This is something I wanted to ask you about while we were filming it. I didn't really get to that. How do you sort of react to like the COVID-19 conspiracy sort of community and the anti-vaxxers, and what's your perspective on that? I've never heard you speak to that. I'm sure you have, but I'm curious.
And you certainly don't
personally.
have to if you're not comfortable with it.
No, there's nothing I'm not comfortable talking about. Don't worry.
Good to know.
No topic is off the table. I think
Well,
so.
we're just shut down by the globalists.
Well, I think I mean, we've talked about the whole idea that we've been raised in a society, like we've been socialized under a very specific society, right? So we have to question everything we think we know, and I think that's like the first step to radicalization of any kind, right? And this is why I even push back on any sort of extreme binary of like, oh, leftists get it because they know a bunch of theory versus, you know, other working class rural people that don't identify as anarchists and abolitionists have no idea what they're talking about, right? Like because that feeds into the same like colonial BS. You don't need to actually intellectually read a bunch of theory to understand any of this, right?
Amen.
So I think a lot of different people have actually gotten really close to figuring out what the problem maybe is. And then there's a lot of things systemically in place to distract them, right? And I think that's a better way to think about it, because COVID-19 brought up one very valid, like showed people that the healthcare system was a shit show, but also that, wait, there's kind of a problem when no one was healthy to begin with, right? And therefore, obviously, then when anything happens, you're just going to magnify compounding inequities, right? So if certain people were already sicker because they were chronically ill, they're going to be targeted by COVID. Well, yeah, that's just how it works, right? But beyond that, I think it made it really obvious, for example, with the COVID-19 like vaccine apartheid, right? That till now, like it's like what, 2.9% of Africa has gotten a single, like the African subcontinent has gotten a single dose of COVID-19 vaccine, right? Right away at the beginning, when vaccines came out with Pfizer and Moderna, people realized that like, oh, patents are preventing from the rest of the global South from having access to vaccines, right? And it's just this like, I almost think colonialism loves to pretend like it's so brilliant and so smart and give the illusion of intellectuality while being so fundamentally stupid, right? It's like, how do you think you can restrict an infection to any corner of the world? Of course you fucking can't, right? So if you think you're just going to hoard all these vaccines and you know, give easy healthcare and specific treatments to rich people while everybody else is fighting for crumbs, well, you're not as healthy as you think you are. And I think that also led to then this like bifurcation where you had on one hand valid mistrust of the medical system, given all of what I just talked about, right?
Yes.
And really like valid mistrust coming from just history, ongoing mistreatment and abuse and torture of marginalized communities, right? And then you had also like the Western anti-vax movement, which is largely just concentrated in privileged white communities, right? A lot of them liberal communities. That are quote unquote on board with the climate crisis, right? On board with eating organic, and at the same time, you know, buying into the sort of like vaccines don't do anything, right? So it's always complex, and I don't like addressing like anything as though it's a binary, because on one hand, yes, people have valid mistrust of the medical system for many reasons, right? And we should address that head on without pretending like it's a beacon of light and healing, right? Which doesn't help, and I think further drives mistrust, because you're ignoring the very obvious like big elephant in the room, which is, well, the healthcare system can never provide you with a prescription of food, water, shelter, and care. So how the hell does it actually care about you? We all know it doesn't, right? So let's not, but then how do you address vaccines are important, right? Well, look at where infectious diseases are the number one cause of death, right? In the global south, right? In the global south, it's very rare to see anti-vax movements, because they have been extremely transformative in like at least moving forward some of the things that we used to die by, right? But still, it is the number one cause of death. Whereas here and in other high-income colonial countries, right, it's like cardiovascular disease, stroke, there's other non-infectious diseases related, just because the standard of living has gone up. There's more hygiene and sanitation in these countries, right? But when you look at Black and brown communities here, when you look at poor rural communities here in the US, they have the exact same outcomes, and they're dying at disproportionately higher rates from infectious diseases, just like anyone else in the global south. So that just tells you that a lot of the privilege comes from people feeling like this sort of amnesia about the severe impact of infectious diseases that they can choose to have. It's almost like a byproduct of vaccines working too well, that people are now not aware of their absolute necessity, because in the global south, there's a demand for vaccines constantly, right? Because there's still not enough. There's a demand for antibiotics because there's still not enough. Whereas here, people can question whether we have to finish a course of antibiotics, right? So it's so complex. And I feel like sometimes addressing that complexity can actually like alleviate the concerns these communities are having, because you're not entirely gaslighting them, right? You're not saying, hey, you shouldn't be wary of pharmaceutical companies. Of course, Pfizer and Moderna was in it for profit the whole time. It was very obvious. Look at the vaccine apartheid. Like, none of the other countries got it, right? So, but the fact that that's also a way to say, well, actually they do work, because look at who's getting the vaccine, right? Every rich person got vaccinated first. So it's one of those things where you can't even address any of this by falling into binaries or extremes of like everything works or everything doesn't.
Absolutely. God, that was good.
It's such a gas leak of an issue, you know. It is very difficult to talk about without sending people into these polarized traps.
Oh yeah, it's hard to talk about any of this without sending people into polarized tropes of like leftist, conservative, like
the spring-loaded like associations that are embedded and impacted into every single thing. And this is like really the big thing I wanted to, just personally for me, I mean, we could literally talk forever, but the thing I really wanted to talk about is the way that trauma is this physicalization of the mental, that it really is the key for me personally to understanding how our system functions, how propaganda works, how so many of these people are stuck in these spring-loaded dualities and reactions.
Yeah.
Can you talk about trauma and its role in all of this? And I think it just brings it all together.
So even to begin talking about trauma, I'll try to define how I talk about it, because the word trauma and everything related to quote unquote healing has been sufficiently co-opted and sort of desecrated, sterilized, whitewashed, right? And reduced to some being meaningless. Like, what the hell does healing even mean anymore, right? But the way I like to talk about trauma is thinking of it as through like a macro to micro lens, where the systems that we live under, right, oppressive systems create cultures of oppression, which means that the society that we were born into, right, like, and everything in terms of the norms that we were told to follow, what we were told we should do, must do, have to do in order to survive, along with environmental hazards, right? The toxins and the pollutants that we're exposed to, along with the severance from land. So severance from land and community, missing some of the key things that we need to be healthy, right? It sort of creates a pressure cooker that we're all living in, right? And I think it helps for us to think that one of the most key parts of what I think can allow us to get closer to the revolution is if people can understand how has living in this present society, right, living under these oppressive systems and these cultures of oppression, how has it shaped my overall well-being, right? And that can't be even limited to just physical health, right? How has it shaped the things that I tell myself I must do, should do, have to do? The things that, like, your perception of the world and how you see yourself in it, right? The fact that we think of ourselves as individuals, like the illusion of individuality and how it's been drilled into us, right? And I think that allows for a more compassionate approach to even understanding health, because we're not just defined by intergenerational trauma. We're like, sure, generations of people in our families have been impacted by living under capital colonial systems, right? But at the same time, I think understanding where your pain actually comes from may actually lead you to not just targeting the root cause of your pain, but then thinking beyond it eventually, right? Like once you really understand that, yes, trauma has impacted us, but at the same time, communities across time have found a way to push back against oppression, right? Exist beyond it, despite it, and create intergenerational tools of healing, right? So it's really complex because the conditions that we've been raised in, right? Part of it is, yeah, we've been raised in cages, and that's going to affect how we think and how we live and how we act, right? And I think one of the most important things with thinking about trauma is what's familiar to you is going to feel safe, right? Whether it's actually safe
Even
or
if
not.
it's bad.
And so oppression, any sort of oppression can be normalized if it's just titrated out enough, right? If it's gradually something that you're exposed to and you're told this is just how the world is. And that actually serves a very important role in why it's so hard for us to break systems of oppression, because people don't even recognize it as oppression, right? That's kind of the sort of insidiousness of late stage capitalism, because we're not necessarily living in a world where a lot of us are subject to very overt state sanctioned violence, but a lot of us are also told we're free, right? We don't necessarily have goons coming to put guns to our head and force us to work. The plantation's still here, right? We're all indentured servants, but at the same time, since you're born, you're told you're free. You're told you can just work your way up, right? Climb the ladder. You can, if you just work hard enough,
And
you'll
you're
get to
abused.
potential security and safety in the
Entire time.
future, right?
Yeah.
This carrot is eternally sort of dangled in front of you. And people underestimate, like, we've never, like, this even idea that liberal mental health takes of addressing trauma as it's though, at best a isolated event or a period of your life that was traumatic, or, oh, it was just a traumatic family. I feel like all of those are just very reductive ways of looking at it, right? We've all been raised in a very traumatic society, and there's different manifestations of that. There's obviously different nuances and levels to trauma, right? Given that intersectionality, like more boulders on your back can just crush you more, right? And that's kind of like the different intersections of different identities come to that. But at the same time, it's not ever going to be reduced to a single small thing, right? It's just the society that we live in.
Yeah, that's the goods right there. I just want to say a real, quick little concentrated thing that I wrote out the other day that I feel like was really relevant to this, that people would rather believe that they're a loser and a failure than accept that they lack free will, that their lives have been shaped by forces far beyond their control that cause them pain and ruin intentionally. Admitting you've been disempowered is the first step to regaining control. And so it's like, it really ultimately goes so far beyond like a thing that happened to you, that trauma is something that we are inoculated with 10,000 times a day by this culture that is inherently abusive and oppressive. I'm in New York City, New York, can't help but talk about it. Every single time you walk down the street and you don't make eye contact to somebody is a sort of trauma, because there's a part of us that yearns for social connection, that is hardwired for it. Like, we're not crocodiles. When we see somebody fucking take a spill and get hit in the nuts, we feel it physically. Like when someone else starts crying, we feel it. We have a social impulse in us that is smashed down so many times per day. And that reinforces these stories, these core narratives, these propagandized beliefs that the world is a scary place, that we can't trust each other, that we have to steal things, and the military needs to maintain control, and we need hierarchies, and we need to be told what to do. These things are not just stories we believe. They are reinforced through these internal whips and chains and lashes that bring us to spring back to this baby blanket little ideology of like, oh no, I need to think this because I can't deal with the reality. I can't address this eruptive, bursting, like inferno of feeling and love and truth and honor and dignity and beauty and pain that I feel every day, that people just can't acknowledge how painful life is.
In a weird way, like, feeling those things is what has allowed all empires to fall, right? People have figured it out somehow over time and time over again. Simple things, right? Eventually, like I said, we're not just defined by our trauma, right? Like, we've had intergenerational tools of love, healing. Other collectivist cultures before us have already passed down like ways of being that can allow us to be free, right? Whether it's creative expressions, art, music, taking care of our land, farming in more more regenerative ways. We've already been passed down, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel entirely, right? And I think, if anything, that's more of a testament to this, if like the hope that this can catalyze, right? Like, because I think it can be kind of scary when people think, oh, it's not me. It's the system. And they sometimes can translate that to thinking, oh, good God, there's nothing I can do about that, right? But I think that may be at some point some arc of the journey where you can feel like that, right? That despair can take over. But this is where there, I think, is the next arc of the journey, where we're not just defined by our rage and suffering and pain, but we can simultaneously experience joy and connection and love and care, right? What are we when we're not just running away from something? What are we running towards, right? And I think like a lot of political frameworks do address that pretty well, right? Like even anarchy focusing on there is no end, the means is all we have, right? That we can do liberation today in different ways, right? Like if you think of it as a pie, a tiny slice of the pie will always be, there's certain things where our hands are truly tied systemically, right? I do have to go to work or whatever, do something, right, to pay rent for now, right? And at the same time, there's a huge part of the pie that are things that we've told ourselves we should do, must do, have to do, right? And it can be liberating realizing that there is no me in the individual sense. Everything I've been through has made me, which means if I change my social conditions now, that will actually help my health, that will actually help my well-being, right? So then you ask yourself, what has capitalism and colonialism deprived you of? And those are actually quite simple. It's deprived you of time. It's deprived you of rest. It's deprived you of connection to land. It's deprived you of community. And those are everything. That's it. That's the solution then, right? So rather than just trying to cure yourself and get nowhere with that, right, that actually points you to real, like if the root cause is a severance from community, then a damn good solution is building community, right? And that can't solve every problem, but it can actually like change the trajectory of our collective liberation forever, right? So it's not even just the big things. It actually starts with the day-to-day stuff, right? The relationship building, the everyday actions in terms of how you apply praxis, right? Like how do you actually show up with your liberation values, but every day? It's not big, right? It's kind of the day-to-day thing.
I'm envisioning a vicious feedback loop here and hearing all you're saying there, and I'm going to try to coherently articulate it. Obviously, what the two of you are talking about or speaking to would some people would call Stockholm syndrome, which, punny enough, is in of itself a mental illness, you could say, because of how we have been conditioned through trauma from, the day we're born, living in an environment that's obviously toxic and abusive and causing us to become sicker and sicker through the years, not understanding where the disconnect is and why we are the way we are, and so on and so forth, as you've described. And I think it was you who said it a moment ago, something along the lines of, I'm sorry, I've got really low brain energy today. People getting
Trauma.
over the hump. Yeah, I've got a lot of trauma, y'all, let me tell you. Getting over the hump and just accepting the fact that we've been on the wrong path for a while, but there is a solution and we could accept that solution and go forward. I think it's not so much despair and fear as it is shame. And again, I think that ties into the whole colonial mindset and aspect of running a society from a colonial hierarchical standpoint and the superiority inferiority paradigm, where you've got the people who are always right and know what to do and how to take care of us, and the people that are inherently under that paradigm always wrong and too dumb to govern themselves and be autonomous and what have you. I think it's a shame thing when I look into somebody's eyes as I'm trying to tell them that they have a choice. There are other options. This is not the best way to be living. And this really isn't even a community, as we call it, or even a civilized society. What I see in their eyes are shame. Like they might for a minute have to accept the fact that they were wrong, or the people they loved who raised them that way were wrong. And I think that is what leads to the fear of accepting that there's another way, and this like we are this interconnected species that has the not only the ability but really the obligation to take care of each other and to love each other and do better.
Yeah, I think shame is maybe a byproduct of maybe some of the acceptance of how we've all been complicit, right? Like we're all being oppressed while we're complicit in oppression. That's just how the system works. But also, I think the fear, so it's both, right? Like shame can prevent us from learning, right? Because learning is fundamentally uncomfortable. I like to just think of it more as like positivity is this like illusion that's created in like Western society, almost this chase of positivity, right? Without realizing that like we cannot experience joy, contentment, happiness without actually working through sorrow, grief, pain, like shame, guilt, etc. Right? Like it's all two sides of the same coin type thing.
Hallelujah.
So
Preach.
I think fear is really important, right? Like what maintains systems of oppression. If you can, and that's really the cage that capitalism, colonialism builds for us, right? We're terrified. If we conflate familiarity with safety, then we're terrified of the unknown, terrified of what's unfamiliar, right? So liberation is to us actually terrifying. It feels terrifying to be free, right? If we've never ever had agency to actually feed ourselves, to build houses for each other, to clothe each other, to take care of each other, the idea of not having to turn to authoritarian figures, the idea of not having to rely on the state, which is all you've ever had, right? So it just happens to feel safe because it's all you've ever had.
And the propaganda,
right? Not because it's actually safe.
Yeah, telling us we would be free, that would mean that we would be terrible people that would hurt each other and burn down the planet.
So fear mongering is
what we're doing now, is hurting each other and burning down the planet.
Yeah. So fear, I think, is this very critical tool that maintains oppression, because you're just telling people that anything else is the monster you know is better than the monster you don't know, right? But what if liberation wasn't actually a monster at all? But we don't necessarily somatically know the difference, right?
Yes.
And even pushing back on so I don't even use the framework of just mental illness anymore to be able to even address mental health, because we can just understand our distress as a logical response to systems of oppression, right? As our differences as well. Yeah, there's 1,000 different ways of being and thinking. So why would there be one way to be or exist, right? So I think even the hypercategorization of like our distress into these like mental health labels is almost not as helpful, just because it gets people to think, oh, there's something about me intrinsically, that makes me depressed or anxious, or Marla, go ahead.
I got a kind of a big tangent here, so bear with me. But there's just a couple of things that I want to work into here. This is really what I've been feeling, and it's just been. I'm such a social, sympathetic, externally motivated person that like I can't just sit down and stare at my camera and like do a rant. I need to do it with somebody. Like the person that I'm talking to really determines like the caliber and the quality and the frequency of the words that I want to say and the feelings that I get in me. And so you're the person that I really wanted to like bring this out of me. Maybe that sounds selfish or something. I don't know what that sounds like, but that's just me.
Sounds like teamwork.
Yeah, I feel like that we're so inoculated into trauma, and shame is the microdose that keeps us every minute of every day, like internalizing it and whipping ourselves in this prison that is individualism, that we think that it's our fault and our problem and there's only me and the only solution is for me to pull myself up on my bootstraps and clean my room and buy Jordan Peterson's book. And so it's just like, I think about all these things kind of swirling together, like free will is really just the thing that keeps coming back to that. I think about this awareness that what we were just saying that about mental illness doesn't exist. Jacques Fresco said, all people are perfectly adapted to their environment, perfectly adapted. The sociopath, the serial killer, perfectly adapted to the things that they went through. They went through experiences where you and any other person, I think this is at the core of like so much spiritual truth of things that Jesus was talking about, of things that all these mystics were saying is like, I am you. You love your neighbor as yourself because you are your neighbor. Because if you went through their circumstances and you went through the trauma,
you would do the exact same thing.
You would, and because we're human beings. Because we don't have the kind of free will. We're just blindly bumping around making choices. We are structurally sort of mandated by our environment into these decisions.
Like, what would it I also just asked myself then, what would it require for us to actually know who we are in a way where we're like sure about who we are, right? We haven't internalized the values of the empire. These are just my ideas. Like that would require like what gives us safety? Actual safety comes from us feeling supported and loved and cared for unconditionally, right? If we have a communal safety net that we can fall back on, that actually allows us the safety to go explore, right? Where we actually have free will to feel out who we are, right? To feel out how we can belong in community, what our role in community may be. Then whatever we come out the other end is going to involve us being truly authentically ourselves, right? So right now it's just, I have to accept that there's going to be a big chunk of me that isn't necessarily like who I chose to be. It's just whatever I made sense of myself given the cages that I've been raised in, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, that also tells you, well, how could I get closer to figuring out who the hell I actually am? Community, right? being in community, like being in reciprocal healthy relationships, right? Being in community, being in different contexts of community where I can, like, we're meant to be raised by a village, not two people, right? So can
Yes.
you imagine how difficult it would be for us to have a very binary, closed mindset if we were raised by like 60 different people that are very different, think differently, act differently, behave differently, care about different things? It's the kid coming out of that kind of setting, right, is an open-minded person who understands that what makes us stronger as a community is a diversity and multitudes of different ways of being, right? That there is no 2 or 3 ways to think or even one way to think, right? So it's kind of interesting that, like, even now, if we realize that, then building community ultimately has made me realize who I am in relation to other people, right? Oh, this is what I actually care about. Oh, this actually makes me really happy. But what lets me even explore is having some sort of safety, even whether it's within a container of a specific community or within a container of a healthy relationship, right? So even despite the overarching context of oppression that we exist in, that's where I think it can help once people realize that the things that you do every day changes, right? Like, eventually when you realize it's okay if you've just prioritized climbing the ladder so far, it's okay if you've chased the carrot of success,
Right.
right?
That takes the
Use
shame
that.
away.
What could you
Use it-
have
use
done?
what you've accumulated and
Right.
gained to
Like,
share to
what
other
could
people,
you
to bring
have
them up.
done, right? Like, it's okay. So if you were born into wealth, fine, redistribute it, right? If you just, I very much bought into the narrative of, like, I got out of my village. Like, honestly, it sucked for me to have, to some extent, belong to, like, quite well and fit in quite well when I, like, erased my own culture, erased my own language, and tried to fit into, like, academic elitist spaces, right? And now I'm realizing, if I just, like, if that guilt ate away at me, I would do nothing, right? But I realized that was designed to happen. Like, that pattern tracks. People around the world are acting like this. There's nothing about me that's unique, and that's liberating. Knowing my problems aren't unique, knowing my pain is not unique, knowing the shit that I do, my bullshit is not unique. There's people all around the world doing this. There's something liberating about that, right? Because you
That's
realize, holy
solidarity.
shit, people around the world are trying to figure it out. People around the world, like, I don't have to have the exact same pain as someone else to realize that, wow, we can actually, like, share our struggle, right? That also means liberation is something inevitably bound together, right? That if I can find healthier relationships, I can be free in that container, right? Maybe in that, relationships are where we can literally apply values of liberation today, right? If we wanted to. It's not going to be easy. And I know that, right? So whatever I'm familiar with is going to be what I try to default to. But when I know that, then I can sort of microdose on change, right? Learn to sit with discomfort a little bit, right? Because learning anything is going to feel uncomfortable if you have to first dismantle what you thought you knew, right? And I think even realizing that gives you a little bit more compassion for yourself, because I know there's bullshit today, and this is a lifelong journey. There is no end point, right? There's no point where we're healed. There's no point where we're radicalized enough. And that's, I think, the, like, caveat of trying to take down the matrix while having to plug in and out of it, right? We just do. We have to. So of course we're going to keep falling back on things. Of course we're going to fall back on our patterns. Of course we're going to fall back on, like, going back to something that we thought we had, quote unquote, healed from, right? As long as we have compassion to realize, oh, I did it again, right? This is a lifelong journey of, I already know there's certain things I am getting wrong right now that I'm probably going to realize in 2 months, right? That's just the nature of this, like, just living in the world that we live in. But I think that allows us to approach the unknown with more curiosity than fear,
Definitely,
right?
definitely.
Like, I wonder what I'm gonna,
Because
I
you
wonder
already
what bullshit I'm
know
gonna learn.
that you're making mistakes, so you give
Right.
yourself allowance to continue
Yeah.
making mistakes on the premise that you're going to learn and expand
And
and
the only way
become.
you'll do that is in community, right?
Yes.
The only way you're ever going to do that is in community. That's the value of where accountability can be a beautiful thing, not just something we run from, right? If we're in reciprocal relationships where someone says, "Hey, I don't know, it sounds like you're projecting," and I'm now like, "Oh, good God, I probably am." So, and then you
Well, if
just
you
learn
have
and
the
you move on.
feedback that 10 different people can say, actually, I see it this way. Yeah, I think you're right. And instead of a way of just a bunch of strangers online calling you out for it and being like, yeah, you're fucking two-faced, or like,
And
you
that
said
happens
this, or I'll dig up
because of
posts and
hyper
read receipts and
individualized
shit.
culture, because we're all supposed to be competing so hard against each other.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's the irony of, like, a lot of the problems you see on the quote unquote left are people falling back on capitalism and individualism and colonialism as a way to try to solve them, right? So people approaching everything from a domination, like seeking to dominate, right? Seeking to be right rather than to be free, wanting to win an argument rather than learning to like understand,
ego,
right? So those are like people just not realizing, and this is where doing activism as though it's something that's external to you, where you're just going to have to go pick up a megaphone and advocate for something, right? Without realizing that like, no, you've been traumatized by the system that you live in. Everything you think you know, you are the system. Exactly. Everything you think you know.
This is the kind of part two of like that initial tangent, is that like we're all just reactions because we don't recognize the state that we're in. We don't recognize that we're all fired up on trauma and hurled into this direction. And I just think that like the root of capitalism, the root of where this came from is a trauma, is eventually, or somewhere back in our deep history, someone was traumatized. Someone had trust taken from them. A fucking log fell on them and they couldn't trust people. And I don't know what it was, but somebody in a healthy, sane community where they were adapted to their environment, it could have been a mass climatic change.
And I mean,
it adapted and pushed them out of that safety and trust, and they started to accumulate and hoard and dominate because they felt like they had to. Because someone did it to them.
And I mean, and again, it's not even a binary of like, I don't want people to think of like they're nothing but their trauma, right? That's not true either, right? Like, despite what we've been through, we found ways to like seek safety in friendships, like as kids, right? Where there's something that we realize, I care about you, and I'm going to show up for you every day without a binding contract, just because we're having fun together. That's it. That's the point of life.
Live all our lives.
Right? So we've done it. Even if it's having friends as kids, right? Like we figured out that there's something beyond this, right? We figured out through time, like, and I think even people thinking that white people don't have culture is honestly one of these sad things where it's like people have always existed outside the confines of capitalism and colonialism, right? So in order for colonialism to be successful, whatever's considered, again, it being a social construct, white cultures had to be erased, collectivist cultures had to be erased first, right? And then whatever, like capitalism is the absence of culture. That's what it really is, right? And now you have a bunch of existential crisis, right? People are walking around saying, what's the point? What's the point? Because everything that gives their life meaning and purpose has been taken from them, right? The land, direct connection to the land, direct connection to people, right? Such that everything you do is actually impacting people, not going to like made up profit centers.
And real quick, also just unmediated contact. We don't have direct contact.
Like not
we have to mask up with money. We have to mediate our exchanges.
Right.
And
transactionality.
It can't be truly flowing, circulatory, reciprocal with this, I owe you this and you owe me that and we're square. It's like we can't just be free together. We can't be free to not fucking tally and quote all of our fucking interactions.
And on the note of everything meaningful and purposeful has been taken from us, proxies are being sold back to us. Whatever you need.
Exactly.
So
they do a good job of taking advantage of our intrinsic need for connection, right? Or saying, hey, like you do need a connection to you. How about you go escape in this cabin somewhere else, or go to this meditation retreat in the middle of nowhere? It's taking an intrinsic need that people have to belong. Because why are conservative like Reddit so successful? Right? It's taking advantage of an intrinsic need that people have to receive validation from in community, to be seen, to be heard, to want to belong to something. It's odd because it shows that people actually don't like being individuals. They always want to be part of something far greater than themselves.
Yes.
Right? Being an individual is boring. Of course, we want to be part of something that's much bigger than ourselves. And then it takes advantage of that and sort of like, co-ops it, right? But I think we can learn from that too, saying that like there's certain things that we can work on in terms of not being so binary, even on the left, about like who we talk to, who we don't talk to, right? Because trauma is being aware that like people have been raised in these systems. So maybe if we just skip the jargon and just talk to another human being by trying to understand their life, right? Trying to understand where they come from, right? That's, that you can make connections about how like you deserve so much better, right? Starting there as opposed to like, here's a lecture on capitalism, right? Because we all know beyond all of the political jargon that people out there, even the most conservative people, understand that they're frustrated because of something, right? They're tired and exhausted and depleted because of something, right? And maybe we can speak to that rather than made up sort of intellectual BS.
Right.
Yeah, just speaking, you said something earlier, I can't remember the exact tangent, but it's basically like we need to feel sad. We need to feel anger and pain and pity. And we feel these things inherently. And it is such a powerful fuel source that the right wing is completely dominated by it. They are so good at manipulating fear and that trauma that white people feel, that they're scared of their shit being taken away from them because that's the basis of their whole society. And so we need to be able to, one, like in our own selves, like go beyond the individual. That's something I'm just obsessed with. And it's so integral and so important that we need to realize, like, your dreams, your individual personalized dreams to get the girl and get the job and
Get
all
the
this dumb
car
shit
and
is
yeah.
piss ant shit. It is so
Mhm.
small. And it's just like, we as individuals cannot conceive of our utility in nature. Like, leaves do not have a big eyeball that just points them right in the immediate direction they go. They like work and find toward it, and they
They just do
gravitate.
it, right?
And
And
there's
I
all these
think that's part of
relationships.
getting inspiration from nature, right? Like understanding that like we are part of nature, we're not separate from it, which means that we have the same needs as every other living being, and they're already doing it without a government controlling them or having a boss, right? That they're already in complex interspecies
They
collaborative
have a ton
interactions.
of
It's
it.
not competition,
Trees don't go to
Yeah.
the DMV.
It's
right?
generalized
They don't need a
perspective.
license. Ducks don't need a license to fly. They just do.
Right, but I mean it tells us that there is like both chaos and order at the same time. It just works out, right? And there's something hopeful about that, knowing that like we will get there, we will figure it out, because fear is unsustainable, right? No matter how
Fear
much
is
you terrify and
unsustainable.
scare the shit out of people, at some point fear, you will get numb to it. At some point you have nothing to lose, right? And we are getting so close to people having nothing to lose anymore, right? That's really
And
where
that's
late
good
stage
and bad.
capitalism has pushed us,
Yeah.
right? But love is sustainable. Fear is not a good motivator, right? Fear, you're going to run out of that at some point. Love is a sustainable motivator. People will do anything for love, right? And have no regrets about it, because that's how our communities work, right? That's the like force of life that's flowing between microbes and plants and animals and then flowing into us. Like just love, care, right? We don't need to do anything else. We care, and that's enough, right? I don't need a profit incentive. I just fucking care. And that's enough to keep me going for the rest of
And
my life
that'll
until I
keep
die
you
and beyond,
healthy.
right? Yeah, right. Like I hope my rotting body is like home to like a thriving ecosystem, right? Love. It's just, it works.
Love is all of us realizing ourselves through each other. That's the essence of health, isn't it? Community. Ecology. I love Ayesha. More to come with her. And I love you, dear listener. And of course, if you loved that episode, do the thing and like and subscribe and share and all that jazz. Follow Ayesha at Woke Scientist, subscribe to her Cosmic Anarchy newsletter, head to her website for ways you can practice decolonial medicine at the personal, ecological, and community level. And please support the mutual aid projects she's always boosting up as an act of true self-love. Mutual aid. Do it for your health. As always, thanks for listening, and more to come, always. The fight goes on. Remember, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.